Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you today. This is our class in the 10th chapter. We're studying in the 10th chapter of Luke. We're happy to have all of you join us this morning. We hope there's a bunch of you out there joining us. We've gotten to the point in Luke that we're going to be studying in about the Good Samaritan today. We had a good class last night. This is a Thursday morning when this is originally recorded, and this is the original recording. So we had a good study. We were studying the 17th chapter of Acts. We'd love to have you join us there on Wednesday nights if you can. And we're glad to have you today. Let's go. Let me tell you how you can reach us. This is a participation class so that you can join us. All you have to do to join us, the two easiest ways is to write us on chat, which you'll see just to the side of this YouTube broadcast or the bottom or somewhere. I don't know where it is on your instrument, whatever you're using to look at this with. Just join us on that and you'll be through to us just about right away. Somebody will tell me just as quickly as they can that you're there and that you want to talk to us, and I'll be with you. We also, you can reach us at 257-3000. That's a local number, 317-257-3000. This program, of course, comes to you from the High School Road Church of Christ, 3103 North High School Road in Indianapolis. You can also reach us at proveallthings@comcast.net. Any of those will get through to us fairly quickly. The phone and chat maybe a little quicker because we watch those a little harder. But all you've got to do is join us in those ways. Let me. I didn't inform our engineer. Engineer, if you can pick up this map over here that I'm showing, that would be good. I don't know if. Can you make that switch quick enough?
Yeah.
We wanted to sort of set the stage. You know, Jesus, during this period in Luke, we've talked to you, is in a Judean part of the ministry. He's out of Galilee now. He's been rejected up in Galilee, and now he's decided to try to work in Judea, and has sent the 70 out. That was the early part of this chapter. And working in that area, teaching in that Judean area. He's going to spend about 2 months doing that. And then he is going to retire back over here to Perea. I'm hoping you can see my little pointer here. Back over to Perea into that area, and then he's going to come back. Now, the event that he's referring to, and this is a story, don't know whether it's a true story or not, could have been a true story, or at least some elements of it could have been true. But it refers to a road that runs from Jericho down to Jerusalem. It drops down in here, and then goes down through Bethany and then into Jerusalem. And he refers to a man, he uses an example of a man who was attacked along this road. And some people say that it was known as the Red Road because it was so dangerous. You know, one of the big problems I have in teaching about this is the fact that I've preached so many sermons about this. You've heard so many lessons about this. If you're already a Christian, I hope you are. And so it's almost hard to teach about it because it's so obvious to people. But maybe there's some things we can bring up about it. This incident comes about in the chronology, as I've mentioned to you, in this section of Luke is not very precise. We know roughly where he was. We don't know exactly when each of these events occurred. May have been at different times. But as we study here in Luke 10, we're going to study two more incidents in Luke 10. This one in the Good Samaritan, and then the incident with Mary and Martha. We have no idea really when either one of these occurred, and both of them are unique to Luke. So we can't get any help really from the synoptic gospels telling us just when this might have occurred. So it comes about as a confrontation that he mentions in verse 25. Behold, a certain lawyer, and this was been a scribe, stood up and tempted him, saying, Master, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? That is, he wasn't that sincere about that question. He did not necessarily really want to know what he needed to do to inherit eternal life. He was simply trying to test the Lord. He said unto him, What's written in the law? How readest thou? He replies, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, and mind. Now, there's two or three interesting things that we could comment about that. A lot of the commentators suggest that Jesus may have, as he makes this response, may have even pointed to his phylactery. That would have been a box that these Jews wore on their head or carried on their arm, hooked by straps. And there are some examples, of course, a lot of examples of that today, and there are Jews today that still wear it. But this phylactery would have contained a quotation from the Old Testament, and it was there to remind them. And that quotation would have been, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy strength, and with all thy mind. And from another passage, that second half, and thy neighbor as thyself, would have been from another passage in the Old Testament, probably not in the phylactery. So anyway, there may have been that interesting element to the exchange. Because this verse was in most of those phylacteries and was considered by the Jews. Jesus refers to it later on when they ask you, What's the great commandment in the law? And he responds in a similar fashion there. But it was very familiar to the Jews. And Jesus says, Thou hast answered right. This do, and thou shalt live. But he, and this is perhaps where this comes from back up in verse 25, when it says he tempted him, he was tempting him. It says in verse 28, verse 29, he willing to justify himself. That is indicating maybe he wasn't that sincere. Said unto Jesus, Who is my neighbor? Now it's obvious that in the question, and this is such an interesting account because Jesus controls this question, answers it differently. Who is my neighbor? And the indication is that the man who lives next door to me, or just exactly who should I be neighborly to? Who is my neighbor that I have to love my neighbor as myself? So Jesus commenced this, and this lesson, which is I'm sure very familiar to all of you, has been preached about 1,000 times. I may have preached about it 1,000 times. Who knows? But I've seen so many interesting lessons about it. One of the previous preachers at High School Road was Brother Loren Rains, and he left behind, or somebody had made copies, and another one of we didn't have charter members, but one of the original members of the church saved a lot of those. And I remember going through his notes of some of these sermons, copies of some of Brother Rains' sermons, and one of them was on the Good Samaritan. And Brother Rains commented that these various men involved here were exemplifying the golden rule and the iron rule and the silver rule and so forth. And by that, he referred to the thieves. Certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. It was a very dangerous road, sometimes known as the Red Road because it was so dangerous. Thieves, it went down a narrow ravine, and this would have been the iron rule in Brother Rain's sermon, where might makes right, I believe, was the illustration that he was using in this. He fell among thieves, which stripped him of his raiment and wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. Uh, there are two or three interesting things about that half dead. It is translated a little differently in some other instances. I'm getting over this cold, but somehow or other I get to talking and strain my voice. So if you don't mind, I'll sip coffee every now and then and advertise trucks. But perhaps you'll forgive me. Anyway, that was the iron rule. By chance, there came down a certain priest that way. And when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Now, it's hard to tell which way the priest was going, whether he was going from Jerusalem to Jericho. It was a regular road from Jericho to Jerusalem. But apparently, this priest may well have been serving in his course in the temple. There were 24 courses. So if he was going to Jerusalem, the implication is that if he went over and touched that man who was there, it may well have been dead, touched the blood that he was experiencing, that was there, then he would have been unclean and had to go through the lengthy Levitical sort of procedures to cleanse himself. But the interesting thing about him, pardon me, the interesting thing about him is when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. He didn't even get close. He wasn't even going to chance it. And he may have been afraid of being attacked by the same robbers that attacked this man. May have been just not want to get involved, may not have want to have been unclean or inconvenienced. And then likewise, a Levite, when he was at the place, came and looked on him, at least the Levite, came over and stared at him a while. And then he passed by on the other side. Notice the different words. One of them saw him, but he didn't apparently get close. The other one looked at him. He came and looked on him, and he passed by on the other side, maybe for some of the same reasons, not wanting to get involved, thinking it was that he might be attacked too, and so he hurries on. Now, both of these were Jesus is obviously maybe this was a real occurrence, but Jesus is obviously picking the priest and the Levite and the Samaritan as people. There were many people who traveled on this road who were attacked, and some undoubtedly were killed. It was a tough neighborhood. So Jesus then draws to a certain Samaritan as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion on him, and went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring in oil and wine, and set him on his own beast, and brought him to an inn, and took care of him. On the morrow when he departed, he took out 2 pence, and gave them to the host, and said unto him, Take care of him. Whatsoever thou spendest more, when I come again, I will repay thee. Now, as we think about that, I want to think about a couple of things, a couple of interesting things. First of all, the Samaritans. Who in the world are the Samaritans? Now, if you've studied the Bible, you know that there was a hatred, a tremendous hatred between the Jews and the Samaritans. Well, who in the world were they? So let's take just a minute in this morning's program to sort of identify who the Samaritans were, and give you some dates and times and some indications of those things. When Israel went into captivity, that's the northern kingdom, they were overcome by the Assyrians in 722 BC. Y'all write that date down if you want to make notes. Most of the able-bodied Israelites were deported to various places in Mesopotamia, and people from those other nations were brought into the territory of Israel. Now, they didn't take everybody, but they took most of them, most of the able-bodied men. And they left behind an awful lot of people, and these other immigrants that were brought into there. And this was a policy of the Assyrians, sort of left things peaceful, kept people rattled and upset, and not exactly in the traditional homeland. They didn't rebel much when you did this to them. So they left behind this group, and they intermarried with some of the Jews that were left there, sort of lower class Jews, and they formed sort of a half-breed Jewish population known as Samaritans from their principal city, Samaria. Judah, then, that's the southern kingdom, was taken captive over a period of time, really, from about 606 to 586 BC. And its people are deported to Babylon. They stay there, if you remember the history, for 70 years, so that in 536 BC, 50,000 of these Judeans are allowed to return by Cyrus the king. Well, the Judeans got back, and these 50,000 got back, and they reoccupied their farms and villages, and this sort of threw a lot of the Samaritans who had moved into the southern part of Palestine when the Judeans had been removed. It sort of threw them out of their lands that they had been working for 70 years. Sort of like the situation today when the Israelis moved back into Palestine and sort of moved out the Palestinians who had been there a while. Well, the Jews moved back in, these Samaritans, so right away you had an animosity between these people who were being displaced. The Samaritans either did or didn't want to help the Judeans rebuild their temple and their cities. That can be found in the book of Ezra, chapter 4. But they're told bluntly and rather unceremoniously that thanks, but no thanks. They didn't want them. And from that point on, this hatred began to grow intensely. The rabbinic tradition declared the Samaritans were excommunicated from the Hebrew covenant about 333 BC. A fellow by the name of Manasseh, who was a grandson of the Judean high priest, persuaded, but he was also, by the way, the son-in-law of Sanballat, the governor of Samaria. He persuaded Cyrus, the king of Persia, to allow him to build a temple to Jehovah on Mount Gerizim as a rival to the temple in Jerusalem. Hey, you're not going to let us go to have part in that temple in Jerusalem? We'll build our own temple up on Mount Gerizim. He made himself the high priest and convinced some of the priests from Jerusalem to join him there, and allowed them to marry various heathen women, and that can be established from the book of Josephus. John Hyrcanus, who was the king of Judea at the time, he was a Hasmonean, destroyed the Samaritan temple on Gerizim along with the city of Samaria. He tore it down. So when Jesus refers to it in the New Testament, it was in essence not a good building. It was a ruin there when Jesus refers to it in John 4. Herod the Great rebuilt the city of Samaria, not the temple, but he rebuilt the city of Samaria and called it Sebaste. Some of you, as we've studied in the New Testament, have heard us refer to Sebaste. We might mention that it may have been that Jesus worked in the city of Sebaste as a carpenter, he and his father, perhaps, in the process of that building. It was called Sebaste, which is the Greek for Augustus, in honor of the Roman emperor. He built another temple for the Samaritans in Sebaste, Herod did. Samaritans didn't like it, refused to use it, and continued to worship in the ruins on top of Gerizim. And that's what's referred to in John 4 and verse 20 that I mentioned earlier. Around 6 to 9 AD, the gates of the temple in Jerusalem are opened at midnight. Some Samaritans had snuck into the area, and they ran into the Jewish temple, pardon me, at midnight, and scattered human bones in its porches. And from then on, Josephus says the Samaritans were excluded completely from the services. And in 52 AD, Samaritans attacked some Jewish pilgrims traveling south to one of their annual feasts. The Jews counterattacked, and the struggle became so fierce that the Syrian governor, the Roman governor in Syria, had to send in troops, and they crucified a number of Jews as a punishment for the riot. So that the Samaritans were cursed by the Jewish people. One proverb in some of their documents says that a piece of bread given by a Samaritan is more unclean than swine's flesh. They often refer to them, as you read their literature, as Cuthians and a worshiper of the pigeon. And so Jesus chooses, as he's telling this story, he chooses a Samaritan. To say, when we're going to talk about neighbors, he chooses a Samaritan to be his example of a good man, a good neighbor. But I tried to tell you all of those things to just try to set the stage, if you will, on this situation. 2 or 3 other interesting things. He bound up his wounds. That actually is, that's what we say. Actually, in the Greek that Luke is using, it is, the verb is bound down. But I don't think anybody who's reading in English would understand what he says when he says he bound out his wounds. But that's actually what the word means. It was a sort of a medical detail that's sort of interesting that Luke throws it in and uses it. The word wounds, which is traumata, that's used here is this is the only place that's used in the New Testament. He says he poured on them oil and wine. Now, I think that's significant, and I want to call it to your attention. I'll show you why here in a minute. It says oil and wine were, pardon me, aren't you glad we're not having this class live so you'd be inflicted? Oil and wine were household remedies, even for wounds. The oil was a sort of soothing thing, and the alcohol was an antiseptic. Now, the reason I mention that is that this was just sort of a first aid sort of thing. If you turn with me over into James, now I've seen an awful lot of people that say crazy things about this passage. It's in James 5, I believe it's 5, yep, James 5 and verse 14. He says, is any sick among you? Let him call for the elders of the church and let them pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord. Now, a lot of people have sort of taken the position that that's ceremonial. So I've known a lot of Pentecostal preachers who'll haul around a bottle of oil with them, and they'll sort of tap it on your forehead to anoint you with oil. Well, that's not what the Samaritan did. He poured in oil and wine as a soothing sort of first aid remedy, and wine as an antiseptic. I think those are fairly obvious solutions to this problem. I've got to check the time. I'm not used to this 30-minute time. I'm used to just blathering on for an hour. My engineer's over here going to sleep. Let me remind you, and he's going to stick this up in your face. We got 7 minutes more. You can join in this. I don't intend this to be a soliloquy. You can join us by just clicking on this live chat and or to call us at 1-800-423-2484 if you're listening long distance, or 257-3000. We'd love to have you join us right away. But anyway, let's go ahead. On the morrow, he took him to an inn, and this is not like a Motel 6 exactly. This would have been a sort of caravanserai. I think that's the word they use a lot, where he could have stabled his animal, and wouldn't have been very posh, but it would have been all better than nothing. On the morrow, when he departed, he took out 2 pence. This is 2 denarii, which would be actually quite a bit of money. It doesn't sound like much money when you read it in English, but it actually is quite a bit of money, and which would have probably lasted several days in caring for this man. It wasn't just one day's rent. Gave them to the host, and said unto him, Take care of him, and whatsoever thou spendest more, when I come again, I will repay thee. So it wasn't just a one-time thing. He said, I'm going to take care of him for a few days, but after that, he's on his own. He'll have to either get better or whatever. He doesn't say that. It's just a remarkable act of compassion and generosity. So, let's go on toward the conclusion. Which now of these 3, the priest, the Levite, of course, or the Samaritan, which now of these 3 thinkest thou was neighbor to him that fell among the thieves? Now that, you see the subtle way that Jesus has changed this? The scribe had asked you, who is my neighbor? Jesus doesn't care about who is my neighbor. He said, who are you neighbor to? You have the obligation of being a neighbor, even to people that you hate and despise. And the man says in verse 37, he said, he that showed mercy on him. Then said Jesus unto him, Go and do thou likewise. You notice in verse 37, he couldn't even say the word Samaritan. Jesus had introduced him as a Samaritan. Was it the priest, the Levite, or the Samaritan? This man, when he responds, can't even say. His prejudice wouldn't even allow him to say the word Samaritan. All right, we got something here on chat. It says, it seems that the Samaritan went to more expense than just paying for the inn. The oil and wine would have been expensive. Well, that's certainly true. I don't know how expensive they are today. From the commercials I see on TV, apparently it flows about freely as water. But yes, you're right. It's interesting. He didn't limit his expense at all. He was willing to care for it. Now that 2 pence, a denarius, was the average pay for a working man for a day in that period of time. Now, the average working man today makes what, $80 a day, roughly? Would that be fair? That'd be $80 to $100 a day. I'm sorry if you're not making that much. So basically, he left $200 there to provide for this man. And that would have cared for him for, as I say, several days. But not only did he pour in the oil and wine, he put him on his own beast. He didn't convenience himself and make the other fellow kind of stumble along behind him. He put him on his own beast. He paid for him, and he said, listen, if there's more needed, you care for him, see to it when I come back. Now that says several things. First of all, it says the innkeeper knew him. and trusted him, and he had a good reputation with the innkeeper for paying his bills. And secondly, it speaks of his generosity. So yes, he did not spare the expense. He did not pinch the penny on caring for this man. And I think that's a good feature, and I appreciate your comment. Uh, all right, I think I'm gonna stop there if I don't have any other comments. We're going to go to this last section, as I indicated to you earlier. There are two sections here. They are not necessarily chronologically connected. The next section, we know roughly where it is, not from Luke, thank you, but we do know roughly where Mary and Martha lived. We'll talk about that, and probably then, if we have time, next Tuesday, this will be at 10 o'clock again, we will move on into chapter 11. It's good to be with you today. You might remember our next service is going to be on the Lord's Day. We meet at 3103 North High School Road in Indianapolis, Indiana. We're going to be meeting at 9:30 for a Bible class. Brother Andres Pong, who normally teaches our Spanish class, is teaching in Brownsville, Texas this week. And we certainly wish him well. It was very good to see. I looked on Facebook last night, and he sent us a picture of one of our former members, and we had lost touch with her, and it was a real joy to see her again on Facebook last night. She seems to be doing well. But our adult class in English is taught by Brother Alan McKee, who's with me often on Tuesday nights in our regular program, and he's teaching in the book of Genesis. A very good class. Alan's a good teacher. You do well to study along with him. And then at 10:30, we'll have our morning worship. There'll be another wonderful sermon by yours truly. And again, at 6 in the evening, my engineer is laughing at me. Another service at 6 in the evening, and we'd like to have you come out and be with us. 3103 North High School Road. We appreciate it. You can reach us still, prove all things at comcast.net. If you have a question or comment, if it's in Luke, we'll deal with it. If it's not, we will deal with it on Tuesday nights at our normal question and answer program, Prove All Things. So, if the Lord wills, we'll be back with you again.